That is exactly what he wanted me to be. A quiet old man with a big house and no spine. Let me back up. My name is Douglas Mercer. I am 67 years old and I live alone in a 4-bedroom house on the shore of Georgian Bay, about 2 hours north of Toronto. I built that house with my own hands. Not literally, I am not a carpenter, but I chose every beam, every window, every piece of slate on that kitchen floor. I paid for it myself over 30 years, working as a civil engineer for the province of Ontario. I retired 4 years ago with a pension, a clear mortgage, and the deep, quiet satisfaction of a man who had never asked anyone for anything. My daughter Francine is 34. She has her mother's eyes and for a long time, her mother's good sense. Her mother passed 8 years ago, breast cancer, quick and merciless. After that, it was just the two of us, and we were close in the way that loss makes people close. We called each other every Sunday. She came up to the Bay every Canada Day weekend. We had a rhythm. Then she met Kyle. I want to be fair. I want to be the kind of father who gives a man a chance. I tried. I genuinely tried. The first time Francine brought Kyle to the house, I shook his hand, poured him a decent scotch, and listened to him talk for 2 hours about himself. He sold commercial real estate in Mississauga. He drove a leased BMW. He had strong opinions about everything and knowledge of very little. But he made Francine laugh, and she had not laughed enough since her mother died. So I kept my mouth shut and I poured him another scotch. They got married 18 months later. Small ceremony, backyard of a friend's place in Burlington. I gave a speech. I meant every word of it. I told Kyle that my daughter was the finest person I had ever known, and that loving her would be the great privilege of his life if he understood what he had. He did not understand what he had. It started small, the way these things always do. He stopped coming to the phone when I called. He told Francine that my house was a bit much, by which he meant too nice for a retired man to own outright without owing anyone anything. He suggested twice that I might be more comfortable in a condo in Barrie. I ignored it. Old men are very good at ignoring things they have decided not to act on yet. Then, 14 months into the marriage, Kyle lost his job. 40% of the sales team, gone overnight. It happens. I felt genuine sympathy. I called him directly, which I almost never did, and I told him the market turns and that he was talented and would land on his feet. He thanked me in the flat voice of a man who had already decided someone else owed him a solution. 3 weeks later, Francine called me on a Wednesday, not our usual Sunday, and she sounded strange, careful, like she was reading from a script someone had handed her in the other room. She said Kyle had been offered a short consulting contract, something in Calgary, and he wanted to bring some of his colleagues out to the house on Georgian Bay beforehand, a sort of working retreat. She said it would be 8 people, maybe 10, for about 3 weeks. I asked her if she would be coming. She hesitated. She said she had her own work commitments. She said it would just be Kyle and the guys. I sat with that for a moment. 8 to 10 men, 3 weeks, in my house, without my daughter, without me, without anyone who gave the first thought to the fact that this was not a rental property, that it was my home, that the kayaks in the garage were my late wife's kayaks, that the quilt on the guest bed was sewn by my mother who died in 1987 in Sudbury. I said, "Tell Kyle I will call him tomorrow." She said, "Dad, please just be reasonable." That word, reasonable. I have found in 67 years that when someone tells you to be reasonable, they are usually asking you to accept something unreasonable without complaint. I said goodnight and I sat in my kitchen and looked out at the bay for a long time. The water was flat that evening. There was a loon out past the dock, calling once, then going quiet. I have lived on this bay for 11 years and I still find it remarkable, that sound. It clears the head. By the time the loon dove and disappeared, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I did not call Kyle the next morning. I called my lawyer instead. His name is Arthur, and we have known each other for 22 years. He handled my wife's estate. He is the kind of man who speaks slowly because he means every word and does not see the point of words he does not mean. I explained the situation. Arthur listened. Then he said, "Do you want to let him in or do you want to stop him at the gate?" I said, "Neither. I want to let him in and then I want him to leave owing me money." Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Give me 2 days." He called back in less than one. What he had prepared was a short-term occupancy license. Not a lease, which would have triggered tenant protections under the Ontario Residential Tenancies Act, but a private license to occupy specific rooms of a private residence for a defined period. It included a damage deposit of $3,000, a daily rate of $450 per person, a clause prohibiting unauthorized guests, a clause requiring the property to be returned in its original condition, a clause specifying that any damage would be assessed at full replacement value, and a clause indicating that failure to vacate by the agreed date would constitute trespass. Arthur faxed it to me. "Yes, I still have a fax machine, do not start." Then I called Kyle. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been waiting. I told him I had given his request some thought. I said I understood he was in a difficult stretch, and that family helped family. I said the house was available, and that I would make sure it was stocked and in good order before they arrived. His voice changed immediately. The careful, slightly formal tone he always used with me dropped away, and what came through was the real Kyle, easy, entitled, already making plans in his head. He said, "Perfect, there'll be 11 of us. We'll need the dock accessible and the boat gassed up if you've got one." I do have a boat. A 17-foot Princecraft that I have owned for 9 years and serviced every spring without fail. I said the dock would be accessible and the boat would be ready. And then I said, "I will need you to sign a short document before you arrive." Standard stuff. Arthur put it together. Kyle said, "What kind of document?" I said, "Just a guest agreement." Arthur likes to do things properly. "You know how lawyers are." He laughed. He said, "Sure, yeah, no problem." I emailed it that afternoon. It was 11 pages. He signed it the next morning. I know because Arthur's office sent me the countersigned copy by noon. I looked at Kyle's signature, a fast, careless scrawl, the signature of a man who does not read what he signs because he has never yet faced a consequence for not reading what he signs. I made one more call that afternoon, to my neighbor Gord. Gord is 69 and retired OPP, Ontario Provincial Police, 28 years on the job. He lives 3 properties north of me, and we have been friends since I moved to the Bay. I told him what was happening, and I asked him if he would be willing to walk me through the proper process if I needed to involve law enforcement at any point. Gord said, "Doug, this is the most interesting thing that has happened up here since the O'Brien kid drove his snowmobile into the ice in 2019. He said he was in. They arrived on a Friday afternoon in late October. 11 men in 4 vehicles, 2 rented SUVs, Kyle's BMW, and a pickup truck I did not recognize. I was not there. I had made sure of that. I had driven down to my sister's place in Collingwood the night before. I had also, before leaving, done several things to the house. I had removed the boat key and locked it in the storage locker in Collingwood. I had removed my wife's kayaks from the garage and stored them at Gord's. I had taken the quilt from the guest bed and replaced it with a standard duvet. I had photographed every room of the house with a timestamp. I had photographed every appliance, every piece of furniture, every window, the dock, the propane tank level, and the interior of the refrigerator. Then I left a note on the kitchen counter. It said, "Welcome. Please refer to the signed occupancy agreement for all terms of your stay. The boat key will be provided upon receipt of the damage deposit by e-transfer. D. Mercer." I heard from Kyle within 4 hours. He called, not texted. His voice had the particular quality of a man who is trying to sound calm and is not succeeding. He said the boat key message was a misunderstanding. He said there had been no mention of a damage deposit when they discussed it. He said the agreement had just been a formality, and he had not really read it. I said, "Kyle, you signed a legal document. The deposit amount is on page 3, section 4, paragraph 2. Would you like me to read it to you?" Silence. I said, "The e-transfer information is in the same section." He said, "Dad, come on." I said, "I'm not your dad." He transferred $3,000 within the hour. I stayed in Collingwood. I let them have their retreat. I let them have the house and the dock and the fire pit and whatever was in the refrigerator, which I had left reasonably well stocked because I am not a cruel man. I talked to Francine twice that week. She sounded strange both times, worried in a way she was working to hide. I asked her if she was all right. She said she was. I did not push. She was an adult and she knew I was there. On day 9, Gord called me. He said, "Doug, you need to come back." Gord is a man of exact economy when it comes to words. When he says you need to come back, it is not a suggestion. I drove back to the Bay the next morning and turned into my driveway at just after 10 o'clock. I sat in the car for a moment before I got out because I could see from the driveway that the fire pit, which I had specifically included as a protected feature in the license agreement, had been moved 3 meters from its original position, and there were scorch marks on the flagstone around it that were definitely not there when I left. One of the dock posts had a fresh crack at the base. There was a garbage bag, split open, sitting in the garden bed along the side of the house. I went inside. I will not describe in great detail what I found because some of it still makes me tired to think about. The short version is, the kitchen looked like it had hosted a soup kitchen that had then abandoned the cleanup portion. 3 of the dining chairs had been dragged outside and left on the dock, 2 of them with water damage from rain. The guest bathroom had a broken towel bar that someone had attempted to rehang with a single screw at an angle. The basement rec room, which was not included in the license agreement, had clearly been used extensively, including the pool table, on which someone had left a ring stain from a bottle. I took photographs of everything. Then I made myself a coffee, sat at my kitchen table, which still had its slate coaster set because I had taken the good ones to Collingwood, and I called Arthur. Arthur said, "How bad?" I said, "Bad enough." He said he would start the assessment. Kyle did not appear until that afternoon. When he came in from wherever he had been, One of the other men had a boat, apparently, and they had been out on the water. He walked through the front door and stopped when he saw me sitting at the table. He said, "You're back early." I said, "I live here." He sat down across from me. He had the look of a man assembling a story in real time. His eyes moved to the right before he spoke, a thing he always did when he was about to say something that was not entirely true. He said the damage had been minimal, that they had been careful, that any normal wear and tear should be expected when you have people staying. I said the agreement specifies that the property is to be returned in its original condition. It also specifies that the basement rec room was not included in the license. Your occupancy of that room constitutes unauthorized use. He said, "Doug, we're family." I said, "You signed a contract, Kyle." He pushed back from the table and stood up and said some things that I will not repeat because they were not interesting, only loud. He said I had set a trap for him. He said I had been waiting for an opportunity to undermine his marriage. He said that Francine knew how I had always felt about him. I waited until he was finished. Then I said, "Arthur's assessment will be sent to you within 48 hours. I would recommend you have someone review it before you respond." The assessment came back at $14,280. It itemized the dock post repair, the flagstone restoration around the fire pit, the dining chair replacement, the towel bar and bathroom wall repair, the basement use fee, which was calculated at the daily room rate specified in the agreement multiplied by the number of days occupied, the propane tank refill to its original level, and the labor costs associated with having the house professionally cleaned. Kyle did not pay immediately. He called Francine, and Francine called me, and she was crying in a way that broke my heart but did not change my mind. She said, "Dad, please. He's already under so much stress." I said, "Franny, I love you. I want to say something and I want you to really hear it." She said, "Okay." I said, "Kyle signed a legal agreement. He did not read it, and he chose not to read it. And that is not something I did to him. He made choices for 10 days in my home that he knew were not right, and the consequences of those choices are his to carry. That is not me punishing him. That is how the world works," said. "I have never once asked you to choose between us. I am not asking now. But I will not pretend a contract is not a contract because it is inconvenient." She said, "He says you set him up." I said, "Did he read the contract before he signed it?" A long pause. Then very quietly, "No." She did not call again for 4 days. When she did, her voice was different, quieter. The careful scripted quality from before was gone. She asked me if she could come up to the bay for a few days. Just her. I said, "Francine, this is your home. You never have to ask." She arrived on a Thursday evening with 2 bags, and her good wool coat, and the look of a woman who had been thinking hard for 4 days and had arrived somewhere she had not expected to land. We did not talk about Kyle that night. We made pasta the way her mother used to make it. Nothing fancy, olive oil and garlic and a lot of pepper. And we sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the bay. The water was dark and very still. She stayed for 5 days. On the 3rd day, without my asking, she told me that she had spoken to a lawyer in Toronto. Not about the contract, about her marriage. She said she had been unhappy for most of the time they had been together, but had not admitted it to herself until the last few weeks, when she had watched Kyle spend 10 days in her father's home treating it like a hotel, and treating the contract dispute as a personal injustice rather than a consequence of his own behavior. She said, "He kept saying you were being vindictive, and I kept thinking, Dad was just protecting his house, like any reasonable person would." I did not say anything. I just handed her the good mug, the wide one, with the blue glaze, and poured her more tea. Kyle paid the assessment 3 weeks later through his own lawyer, with a brief letter indicating that full payment was made under protest and without admission of liability. Arthur replied with a 2-sentence acknowledgement of receipt. I framed neither letter. I am not that kind of man. But I did put them in the filing cabinet, behind the signed occupancy agreement, behind the photographs with their timestamps, behind every piece of paper that documented what had happened and who had chosen what. Arthur called after to say the matter was closed, legally speaking. I said, "Good." He said, "You handled that well, Doug." I said, "I had a good lawyer." He laughed, which Arthur almost never does. It was a nice sound. Francine's situation with Kyle took longer. I will not detail it here because it is her story to tell, not mine. What I will say is that she is doing well. She is seeing a good counselor in Toronto, a woman she found herself and speaks highly of. She has been promoted at work. She is an urban planner, something I am quietly very proud of. She came back up to the bay for Christmas, just the 2 of us, and we made her mother's pasta again, and opened a decent bottle of Ontario Red and sat by the fireplace until 11 o'clock, which is later than I usually stay up anymore. She asked me, at some point in the evening, if I regretted how I had handled it, if there had been a way to do it that caused less damage. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I said, "I regret that it was necessary. But no, I don't regret doing it. A man who won't read what he signs is a man who doesn't believe the rules apply to him. And a man like that, sooner or later, will take more than a dock post and a pool table. She nodded. She looked out at the fire for a moment. Then she said, "He did take more than that." I put my hand on her shoulder. She leaned into it the way she used to when she was small, when the world was still mostly a thing I could fix. I cannot fix everything, I know that. I am 67, and I have buried a wife and navigated 30 years of bureaucracy, and stood at enough bedsides and gravesides to understand that most things cannot be fixed, they can only be moved through. But some things can be fixed. Some things are simply a matter of having the right paperwork and the patience to let a man show you exactly who he is. The loon was back on the bay the following morning early when I went out with my coffee. Just the one. Calling once, then going quiet, then calling again. I stood on the dock and listened for a long time. The water was calm. The house was mine.